victory in Southeast Asia takes away, in its economic aspects, that region that Japan must have as a trading area or have only one place in the world to go, that is, toward the communist areas in order to live, Gravel and 597. In a New York Times interview 13 years later, December 24, 1967, the former president, probably recalling 1953 to 1954 NSC discussions and policy papers, added the same dangers to Japan and added, probably the less said about that right now the better. But the plain fact is that no prosperous free society based on the private enterprise system can expect to exist indefinitely, alongside a sprawling police state like Communist China and its satellites. This hinted that ultimately we might have to extirpate communism in Asia in order to make Japan and other free countries secure. America's Cold War policymakers have shared an amazingly expansive concept of U.S. national security. Can it be accidental that this concept is a mirror image of the feverish growth /nomic of corporate business? Or is it, as Professor Robert Tucker argues in dismissing the primacy of economic factors behind American foreign policy, that economic statements like the ones I quote above are made by U.S. leaders largely to elicit support for a policy that is pursued primarily for quite different reasons? Tucker is not altogether incorrect. Immediate policy decisions often have little to do with demonstrable economic benefits. It would be pure idealism to reduce North American or Western European politics to the rational interests of capitalism in the abstract. The process by which economic forces are ultimately determinant is a complex one in which in specific situations the decisive factors may well be political, psychological, or social. But several points must be kept in mind with respect to American foreign policy and its Indochina disaster. In the first place, the economic declarations contained in the Pentagon Papers were not intended as rhetoric for public consumption. The NSC documents in particular were internal working papers for eyes-only official eyes. It should different be clearly stated. Secondly, what non-economic purposes, what quite reasons underlie U.S. foreign policy. Here, Tucker is consistent. He grants that America's universalism has been throughout indistinguishable from America's expansionism. In the period that has followed the initial years of the Cold War, it is the expansionist interest that has become increasingly dominant. The reason for this expansionism, Tucker alleges, is an exaggerated sense of security, due to the fear arising simply from the loss of preponderance itself. U.S. policymakers, possessing inordinate power, will be ready to use it if only in order to rule over others, just as powerful men have done throughout history. But can Tucker show, can anyone, that such American foreign policy decisions have ever been made on grounds recognizably injurious to the dominant economic power centers? The quite different reasons usually turn out to be providentially consistent with the palpable economic interests of the corporate upper class who, must be repeated, have occupied the key foreign policy post in Washington in the present century. The fact is that America's policymakers exercise both functions at once. They represent the economic elite and the national interest as traditionally understood in marked relative terms. Bound up in a seamless web relationship, these two functions cannot be segregated by any neat boundary. To do so will be dialectically meaningless. The economic blazes paths for the political and the military, as in Latin America, and state power is utilized in ways that rarely clash with pus. Page 44. Business Ideology and Foreign Policy 29. Stabilities for external economic expansion fast in Asia. While Marxists talk about unity of theory and practice, capitalists achieve it, and on an international plane. The interests of the giant U.S. corporations and banks, as their executives never cease to proclaim in their own annual reports and elsewhere, are international. Why should they not fear international communism? Capitalism itself was the very first global system. Long before communism existed, Great Britain The pioneer industrial nation was trading, investing, banking abroad and leading the way toward creation of a true international market economy after 1850. From this moment, any basic threat to these institutional arrangements had to be international, almost by definition. America's foreign policymakers do have legitimate fears, and they project them within the channels of statecraft and diplomacy, which have been an inherent element of the foreign affairs bureaucracies of all great powers since Louis XIV's France. Thus, they enthusiastically respond to challenges of strategic necessity and national interest. Doing so reinforces the self-esteem that elites need to rationalize their own exalted positions in the social hierarchy. They are important men because they are dealing with transcendently important matters. In their own minds, they must satisfy themselves that they are promoting national security, international stability, world justice, all issues loftily above mundane considerations like, as Joseph Schumpeter used to ask, who stands to gain? The official mentality is shaped by the policymakers' sober consciousness of themselves as a deserving political elite, men endowed with all the advantages of what passes for a cultivated upbringing. Trained for public service and somewhat cosmopolitan in outlook, it regards itself as uniquely qualified for leadership, especially in foreign affairs. It believes itself to be a vanguard, willing to accept the terrible responsibilities and risks of world power, from which many of its less intrepid countrymen shrink. What we see operating here is the psychological counterpart of socioeconomic privilege. It is no surprise that some of these powerful men, the Nixons, Rusks, McNamaras, become true believers in the communist conspiracy. This too, however, serves the rhetoric of self-justification required to organize society and tour along corporate, neo-capitalist lines. For if much of America's ruling class is really convinced that communism and socialism are deadly, subversive, aggressive, externally directed menaces, we must remember not only that these beliefs are an integral part of the process of internal justification, not only that in broad, historical terms the proposition harbors a grain of truth, but that selective belief is a result of class breeding and class philosophy. U.S. leaders have been conditioned to oppose the left all around the world because revolutionary aspirations and movements objectively threaten the framework of their own social system, the framework within which they formulate policy and influence the fate of millions of people inside their own country and out. That this power is exercised irresponsibly and immorally is something that the left has long believed. The Pentagon Papers now provide proof. Notes. 1. See the lists of instances of the use of U.S. armed forces abroad, inserted in the Congressional Record by Senator Barry Goldwater, 117, April 26, 1971, S. 5636-47N. Senator Everett Dirksen, 115, June 23, 1969, S. 16839-44. 2. Gabriel Kolko, The Roots of American Foreign Policy, Boston, Beacon Press. 1969, 9-26. Page 45. 30 Gravel Edition. The Pentagon Papers Vol. V. 3. Kolko, Roots, Ch. 1. G. William Domhoff, Who Rules America? Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Prentice Hall, 1967, CHS. 2 and 3, and Who Made American Foreign Policy, 1945-1963. In David Horowitz, Ed Corporations and the Cold War, New York, Monthly Review, 1969, reprinted in Domhoff's The Higher Circles, The Gov. Earning Class in America, New York, Random House, 1970, ch. 5. 4. Harry Mcduff, The Age of Imperialism, New York, Monthly Review, 1969. 13. 5. C. Arthur Maturin, Capitalist Expansion, Ideology, and Intervention, in Richard C. Edwards et al., The Capitalist System, A Radical Analysis of American Society, Englewood Cliffs, N. J. Prentice Hall, 1972. 6. Students assailed defense system. New York Times, October 12, 1969. 7. See Walter Liebhaber, America, Russia, and the Cold War, 1945 to 1966. New York, Wiley, 1967. CHS 1 to 4. And William A. Williams, The Cold War Revisionists. The Nation, 205, November 13, 1967. In the post-World War II period, according to Professor Samuel P. Huntington, the dominant feature of international politics was the expansion of the power of the United States. A critical feature of this expansion was the extension of American power into the vacuums that were left after the decline of the European influence in Asia, Africa, and even Latin America. Americans devoted much attention to the expansion of communism, which, in fact, expanded very little after 1949, and in the process they tended to ignore the expansion of the United States' influence and presence throughout much of the world. Political development and the decline of the American system of world order. Daedalus, 96, Summer, 1967, 927. 8. Telegram to U.S. Embassy in Paris, May 13, 1947, in United States-Vietnam Relations 1945 to 1967. Study prepared by the Department of Defense, Washington, printed for the use of the House Committee on Armed Services, 1971, Book 8, 100 to 102. This is the U.S. government edition of the Pentagon Papers, and will hereafter be cited as USGN. 9. Paul Y. Hammond, Organizing for Defense, the American Military Establishment in the 20th Century, Princeton University Press, 1961, 228, 231. Samuel P. Huntington, The Common Defense, Strategic Programs in National Politics, New York, Columbia University Press, 1961, 114 to 115, 378-81. Kolko, Roots, ZLL. 10. C. Hammond, Organizing for Defense, 353 to 357, 227 to 232. 11. C. Domhoff, Who Made American Foreign Policy, 41 to 46, reprinted in the Higher Circles, 128 to 135. 12. Huntington, The Common Defense, 241, 333 to 334. 13. C. Townsend Hoops, Under Secretary of the Air Force at the time. The Limits of Intervention, New York, McKay, 1969, ch. 10, published in an earlier version in The Atlantic, 224, October 1969. Hoops's account is in close agreement with that of the New York Times Special Report of March 7, 1969. 14. See the references in Note 11, as well as Hoops, Limits of Intervention, 2 to 5. 15. Forward to Books 8 and 9 of USGN. 16. The complete document can be found in USGN Book 8, 225 to 272, which includes NSC 48/2, appended on December 30, 1949. 17. USGN Book 8, 98 to 99, Telegram to U.S. Embassy in Paris, February 3, 1947. 18. EBIT, 219 to 222. Cable to U.S. Embassy in Rangoon, June 20, 1949. 19. EBIT, 155 to 157, 196. Memo on Indochina, March 31, 1949, and cable to U.S. Consul in Hanoi, May 20, 1949. 20. EBIT, 241. 21. EBIT, 256 to 261. 22. Hammond, Organizing for Defense, 347. 23. Cobell Phillips, The Truman Presidency, The History of a Triumphant Succession, New York, Macmillan, 1966, 305 to 308. On NSC 68, see also Huntington, The Common Defense, 247 to 53 and 220 to 221. 24. U.S. JED Book 8, 425 to 445. The quotation is from 428, with emphasis added. 25. U.S. JED Book 9, 202. Cable from Paris to Secretary of State, November 30th, 1953. 26. EDID 510 to 529. Page 46. Business Ideology and Foreign Policy 31. 27. U.S. JED Book 10. 731 to 741. 28. EDID 835 to 852. 29. Cited, for instance, on June 13, 1955, EDID 984. On Dulles' scheme for legally preventing elections, see his April 6, 1955, Cable to Saigon, EDID 892 to 893. On the failure to hold the elections called for in the Geneva Accords, CI 182 to 183, 208 209, 239 to 241. 30. U.S. JED Book 10, 837, 839. See also the CIA Special Estimate of December 15, 1953, 1, 432, 8C. 31. Except by Ambassador to India John Kenneth Galbraith, who caught nowhere. C2, 121 to 125, 147, 669 to 672. 32. For recent surveys, see Peter Walley, Vietnam and the Pacific Rim Strateg. Leviathan, 1, June 1969, and Carl Egles and R. Shaw. CONIAI and MCNR in Change, New York, Macmillan. 1967, CH. 5 Ace. 121 to 130. Professor Robert W. Tucker finds this interpretation of U.S. policy in the Far East difficult to take seriously. American leaders have expressed such views. Tucker admits, but at best. Citation of these views proves no more than conviction, and a mistaken con/action at that. The Radical Left and American Foreign Policy, Baltimore, Johns Hopkins Press. 1971, 116 to 117. One might think that conviction, even if mistaken, provides a rather reliable guide to the formulation and execution of policy. 33. Revival of Japan, naturally, has posed another kind of dilemma for the United States, that of a tough competitor in the markets of the world. On the contradictions of U.S. policy toward Japan, see Walter Lafeber. Our illusory affair with Japan, the nation, 206, March 11, 1968, and Tom Engelhard and Jim Peck, Japan, Rising Sun, in the Pacific, Ramberts, 10, January 1972. 34. Tucker, The Radical Left, 61. This book, despite its weaknesses, is the most astute and fair-minded critique of the radical view of U.S. foreign policy. Most radicals will benefit from reading it. 35. EDID 108. 36. EDID 69, 105, 151. 37. Tucker nowhere takes into account the evidence on this point in Kolko and Hoff, see notes 3 and 11. 38. But see the NSC documents for the kind of stability the United States prefers, not Hochheim's brand. 39. Christopher Lasch, The Making of the War Class, Columbia Forum, 1, New Series, Winter 1971, 3. Page 47. 32. 3. A Vietnamese Viewpoint. By Trong Bu Lam. When the President of the United States declares that American troops will remain in the southern part of Vietnam as long as needed to preserve Vietnamese people's right to self-determination, what he means, quite simply, is that the American military shall not leave Vietnam until a pro-American government in Saigon manages to survive on its own and so maintain that part of Vietnam within the American sphere of influence. It is the self-reliance of a pro-U.S. government then that is at issue, not the self-determination of the Vietnamese people, and certainly not the relationship of the Vietnamese people toward that government. From the beginning until now, that has been the primary concern of U.S. policymakers. The Pentagon Papers demonstrate this clearly, and the Nixon administration recently reiterated the position in unmistakable terms. In his news conference of January 1, 1972, Mr. Nixon imparted the impression that the release, by the Democratic Republic of North Vietnam, of U.S. prisoners of war remained the sole obstacle to a total withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam. The very next day, however, an administration spokesman hurriedly modified the presidential statement. As in the past, he said, the survivability of the Saigon government of President Nguyen Van Thieu remains a second condition for a total U.S. pullout. The Honolulu Star-Bulletin, January 3, 1972. Again, in his speech of January 25, although Mr. Nixon did commit his administration to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam within 6 months were his latest plan accepted. That plan contained conditions that amounted to a demand that the NLF lay down their arms and surrender to the Saigon authorities. My task in this paper is to stress the deception which most have now come to see as a deception, that the interests of the Vietnamese people counted for something in Washington policymaking. With the publication of the Pentagon Papers, Americans can no longer grope for respectability with the adage that we went in with good intentions. When, at the American Historical Association meeting in 1971, two of the authors of the Pentagon Papers, Leslie Jaub and Daniel Ellsberg, were questioned on the lack of material relating to social conditions in Vietnam in the papers, they replied, if the study failed to deal with the underlying social and human conditions in Vietnam, it was because these conditions were not being considered by American policymakers. The New York Times, Thursday, December 30, 1971. Of course, one did not need the Pentagon Papers to learn that, from Truman's administration on, altruistic concern for the welfare of the Vietnamese people meant nothing more than a very sick public relations joke to Washington. Bombs, defoliants, prisoners in tiger cages, political assassinations, these represent the copyright 1972 by Trong Bu Lam. Page 48. A Vietnamese Viewpoint 33. Net contribution of the United States to the welfare of Vietnam. Of interest in the Pentagon Papers, rather, is the unfolding of a policy which, while constantly holding certain American interests in focus, sought to secure those interests with increasingly desperate means, under increasingly untenable conditions. In reviewing all the decisions made which propelled the United States into Vietnam, President Roosevelt stands apart, in that his attitude toward Indochina seems to have included a measure of concern for the area's well-being. Having been drawn into a war in the Pacific with Japan, Roosevelt developed an interest in the affairs of Southeast Asia. Possibly irate during the war over Yushi's policy of surrendering to the Japanese and so affecting a cooperative relationship between local colonial administrators and the Japanese army, Roosevelt decided, in 1944, that Indochina should not be returned to France, but that it should be instead administered by an international trusteeship. France has had the country, 30 million inhabitants, for nearly 100 years, and the people are worse off than they were at the beginning. France has milked it for 100 years. The people of Indochina are entitled to something better than that. Gravel edition, 110. The trusteeship concept was approved by Russia and China, but it met strong opposition from France and, understandably, Britain, which feared that its own possessions would be lost to the concept. Another factor still was to hinder the establishment of a trusteeship. In early 1945, the status of the Pacific Islands, captured by the Allies from the Japanese, came under the consideration of various departments of the U.S. government. The Department of War and the Navy advocated their retention under U.S. control as military bases, Gravel and 114. Avid for one set of territories, Roosevelt found it difficult to deny France another. In a statement issued by the State Department on April 3, 1945, the United States left the question of the international trusteeship of colonial territories on a fully voluntary basis, that is, up to the colonialists. Roosevelt, however, did not quite abandon his plan for Indochina. Earlier, in March, the Secretary of State had in fact drafted a statement in which the United States would explicitly pledge to do all it can to be of assistance to the French government in the latter's moves in reconquering Indochina from the Japanese. Roosevelt refused to issue that statement. After Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, his lingering influence could be seen in the initial U.S. refusal to help the French re-establish the control over Indochina. Which is not to say that the United States favored the Vietnamese, either, who, by mid-August, had gained control over the entire territory of Vietnam and, by September 2, 1945, established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In the American neutral stance, one could already see the balance tilt in France's favor, as indicated in the following document, possibly a telegram sent by the State Department to the American representative in Paris, or Saigon. U.S. has no thought of opposing the re-establishment of French control in Indochina, and no official statement by U.S. GOVT has questioned even by implication French sovereignty over Indochina. However, it is not the policy of this GOVT to assist the French to re-establish the control over Indochina by force, and the willingness of the U.S. to see French control re-established assumes that French claim to have the support of the population of Indochina is borne out by future events. Gravel and 116-17. Page 49. 34 Gravel edition. The Pentagon Papers Vol. V. Between 1945 and 1950, at which time the U.S. government definitively committed itself to the French side in the Franco-Vietnamese conflict, U.S. policy toward Vietnam developed in three distinct stages, in none of which were the interests of the Vietnamese people to come for anything. First, the United States categorically refused to recognize Ho Chi Minh and his organization, the Viet Minh, as the true legal representatives of the new Vietnamese state. In late 1945 and early 1946, the President of the United States and his Secretary of State received at least 8 communications from Ho Chi Minh asking for U.S. recognition of Vietnam's independence, and even for the establishment of an international trusteeship over Vietnam. The United States chose to leave all those messages unanswered. Gravel and 150. It paid no attention to Ho Chi Minh because, as the then Secretary of State put it in his telegram to the American representative in Hanoi, who had a clear record as agent of international communism. What the American diplomat in Vietnam should try to avoid, he went on to say, is the establishment of a communist-dominated, Moscow-oriented state in Indochina. Gravel and 120. Having decided to reject the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the United States sought to forward French interests more and more. The Franco-Vietnamese War broke out at a time when the United States was involved in helping Europe rebuild its economy out of the ruins of World War II. The Vietnamese War also coincided with British and French moves to check Soviet influence in Europe. Under the circumstances, the United States found it impractical to disassociate itself from the French recapture of Indochina. The French, for their part, discovered early in the conflict the usefulness of waging colonial wars under the guise of anti-communism. The merging of American interests with those of Western Europe is clearly demonstrated in the following instructions the State Department sent to its diplomats in Paris and Vietnam. Key our position is our awareness that in respect developments affecting position Western democratic powers in Southern Asia, we essentially in same boat as French, also as British and Dutch. We cannot conceive setbacks to long-range interests France which would not also be our own. Gravel and 131. The commentator of the Pentagon Papers states rightly that, in those years, the United States cared less about Vietnam than about France. Gravel and 151, and that compared with European recovery and escape from communist domination, the United States considered the fate of Vietnamese nationalism relatively insignificant. Gravel and 129. The third stage in the evolution of U.S. policy paved the way for the ensuing Civil War. Being hostile to the government of President Ho Chi Minh, the United States put pressure on France to create an alternative Vietnamese government. The State Department itself instructed its representatives in Vietnam to gather all information available pertaining to the strength of non-communist elements in Vietnam, Gravel and 121. The search for a non-communist Vietnamese region was clearly stated to the French in February of 1947. While the United States fully recognized France's sovereign position in that area Indochina, it advised France to abandon its outmoded colonial outlook and methods. France was to emulate the outstanding examples of Britain and the Netherlands in their respective colonies and yield a measure of autonomy to the Vietnamese. Still, the United States does not lose sight of the fact that Ho Chi Minh has direct communist connections, and it should be obvious that we are not interested in. Page 50. A Vietnamese Viewpoint 35. Seeing colonial empire administration supplanted by philosophy and political organizations emanating from and controlled by Kremlin, Gravel and 131. By the end of 1947, the French did, indeed, establish contact with Bao Dai, the former emperor of Vietnam, with the intention of using him to form a mildly independent, but above all anti-communist, government. The United States, for its part, devoted all its resources to bring about the Bao Dai solution. In 1948, the State Department instructed its ambassador in Paris to urge the French government to leave nothing undone, which will strengthen truly nationalist groups in Indochina and induce present supporters of the Viet Minh to come to the side of that group, Gravel and 132. The United States justly estimated that it would be impossible for any Vietnamese leader to form a government or rally popular support without displaying a modicum of independence. The French, however, were not quite willing to yield even a fraction of their pre-war privileges. Finally, U.S. pressure assumed its familiar financial form. The American ambassador in Paris informed the French foreign minister that the United States was willing to consider assisting French government with respect to matter of financial aid for Indochina through ECA, but could not give consideration to altering its present policy in this regard unless real progress made in reaching non-communist solution in Indochina based on cooperation of true nationalists of the country. Gravel, 133. Immediately on February 2, 1915, when the French government announced the ratification by the French National Assembly of the independence of Vietnam, the United States extended diplomatic recognition to the state of Vietnam, headed by Bao Dai. On February 16, 1915, France requested military and economic assistance in prosecuting the war in Indochina, and rapidly obtained it. In May 1950, the United States publicly announced the beginning of military and economic aid to the government of Bao Dai. An aid mission was established in Vietnam a few days later. From 1950 on, U.S. policy toward Vietnam was not unlike what Washington now calls Vietnamization, except that then, both the French and the Vietnamese were being used. On the one hand, the United States gave France enough money and military equipment to stave off its military defeat. On the other, it siphoned enough aid to the Bao Dai government to enable it to raise an army of Vietnamese men, equipped with modern Western weapons, trained by French officers, to fight other Vietnamese men. Less than a year after the communist victory in China, and at about the time of the outbreak of the Korean War, the United States became totally committed to France's aims in Vietnam. The events in China and Korea did not, as often supposed, incite the United States to blindly adopt an anti-communist stance vis-a-vis Vietnam. That course of action, as we are now able to trace it, had been set back in late 1946. The anti-Ho Chi Minh, pro-French, and then pro-Bao Dai policies stemmed from one and the same preoccupation of the State Departments to stop Moscow-oriented regimes in Asia and in Western Europe from becoming a strong defense shield for the Soviet Union. That the United States, along with much of Western Europe, should have feared the communist threat to their hitherto comfortable world of empires and colonies is understandable. What the United States failed to grasp however, was that socialism, wedded to the desire for independence, had become a formidable local force in many of the old colonies, and that no alleged links to the Kremlin would explain it away. At every stage in the evolution of U.S. policy toward Vietnam, the United States was warned of this analytical confusion by its own agents, or by people familiar with the problem. The State Department made its decisions in full knowledge of the data. 4. Page 51. 36 Gravel edition. The Pentagon Papers full. V. Example. The State Department knew of Ho Chi Minh's commitment to the communist ideology. It also knew perfectly well that Russia had had very little to do in Vietnam. According to...
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, folks. I'm checking out. See you next time. And until next time.